What if the person you love most, the one you trust, the one who swears to protect you, slowly becomes the very thing you need to escape from? What if the life you thought was a dream turns into a gilded cage, where every move is watched, every decision is made for you, and the walls close in a little more each day? Leila Williams had everything, or so the world believed. A brilliant surgeon, married into one of the most powerful families in the country, living a life of luxury that most people could only dream of. But behind the grand estate, the wealth, and the carefully crafted perfection, was a truth no one saw. Because Leila wasn't a wife. She was an outsider. A possession. A woman slowly being erased. Until one night, she made a choice. To run. To leave behind the wealth, the power, the name that carried more weight than she ever could. To risk everything for the one thing that mattered more than anything, her daughter. But escaping was just the beginning. Because when you walk away from people who believe they own you, they don't just let you go. They come after you. This is a story of power, control, and the fight for freedom. And once you hear it, you'll never forget it. Stay with me, because this is where it all begins. Leila Williams had always believed in the power of perseverance. Growing up in a modest, hard-working family in Brooklyn, she had watched her parents push through life's struggles without complaint. Her mother worked 2 jobs, one as a nurse during the day, another as a caregiver at night. Her father, a retired Marine, had built a small business fixing cars, ensuring that his children never lacked the essentials. Their home was not extravagant, but it was filled with love and discipline. As a child, Leila had learned to be independent. Her parents instilled in her a strong work ethic, emphasizing education as the way forward. She excelled in school, devoured books about human anatomy, and dreamt of one day becoming a surgeon. The sacrifices paid off. She was accepted into one of the top medical schools in the country, working grueling hours to prove herself in a male-dominated field. Now, at 31, she had achieved what many only dreamed of. She was one of the youngest cardiothoracic surgeons at a prestigious New York hospital, respected for her skill, feared for her discipline. Her colleagues often joked that she was married to her career. And for a long time, that had been true. Until she met Ethan Calloway. It happened at a high-profile charity gala, one of those elite events where the city's wealthiest came to sip champagne and bid on overpriced art in the name of philanthropy. Leila had attended reluctantly, dragged along by her mentor, Dr. Gerald Simmons, who had insisted it was an opportunity to network. She was halfway through an uninspiring conversation about hospital funding when she felt someone watching her. Turning, she met the gaze of a tall, impossibly well-dressed man across the room. Ethan Calloway. His name was whispered in finance and real estate circles, a legacy billionaire from the South, heir to a family fortune built on oil, banking, and landholdings stretching back generations. He approached her with the confidence of a man used to getting what he wanted. "You don't look like you want to be here," he said, offering her a glass of wine. Leila arched an eyebrow. "Let me guess, you do?" Ethan smirked. "Not particularly. But I suppose it helps when you have a reason to stay." And just like that, she was drawn in. The chemistry between them was undeniable. Over the next few weeks, he pursued her relentlessly, sending flowers to her office, whisking her away on last-minute getaways to private beach resorts, arranging candlelit dinners in rooftop restaurants that overlooked the city skyline. He was unlike any man she had ever met, charming, sophisticated, powerful. And most of all, he seemed genuinely fascinated by her. "I've never met a woman like you," he confessed one evening, as they sat in a dimly lit jazz lounge. "Beautiful, brilliant, and completely unaffected by money." Leila laughed. "That's because I didn't grow up with it. I like that about you." He leaned in, tracing a finger along the back of her hand. "You're real." For the first time in years, she allowed herself to believe in something beyond her career. Love. Their relationship progressed at lightning speed. Within 6 months, she was spending weekends at his penthouse, attending exclusive galas as his plus one, becoming accustomed to a world of private jets and sprawling estates. Then, one evening, he took her to Callaway Vineyards, his family's historic estate in Virginia. The night was warm, the sky a deep shade of indigo. They walked through the vineyard under the glow of lanterns, laughter echoing between the rows of grapevines. Then, without warning, Ethan dropped to one knee. Leila's breath caught. "I don't want to spend another day without you," he said, holding out a diamond ring that sparkled under the moonlight. "Marry me." Her heart pounded. She loved him, but something inside her hesitated. This was fast. Too fast. And then there was his family. She had never met them, not once. When she brought it up, Ethan always brushed it aside. "They're old-fashioned," he would say. "They just need time." Still, she had ignored the nagging feeling in her gut. She had spent her entire life making logical, rational choices. Maybe this time, she should follow her heart. She said yes. And for a brief, fleeting moment, it felt like a dream. But fairy tales were never meant to last. The first time Leila saw the Callaway estate, she felt a chill creep up her spine. It was massive, almost unnervingly so. A sprawling 3-story mansion, its towering white columns stretched toward the sky like ancient sentinels, guarding the legacy within. The driveway, lined with century-old oak trees, wound through miles of perfectly manicured land before revealing the estate in its full, imposing grandeur. The house itself was the kind that belonged in history books, untouched by time, a southern aristocrat's dream with its intricate iron balconies, wraparound porches, and windows so large they reflected entire sections of the sky. Yet, for all its beauty, there was something unnervingly cold about it. Something suffocating. As the driver pulled up to the entrance, Leila felt her pulse quicken. This was no ordinary home, it was a monument to power, a reminder of who the Callaways were and who they had always been. She stepped out, her heels clicking against the polished stone driveway. The air was thick with the scent of magnolias and something else, something older, something heavier. She turned to Ethan, who had just emerged from the car, straightening his jacket as if they had simply arrived at a weekend getaway. "What do you think?" he asked, flashing that signature smile of his. Leila forced herself to return it. "It's impressive." That was the safest word she could find. Before she could say more, the front doors opened, and standing there, perfectly poised, was Eleanor Callaway. Leila had seen photos of her before. Ethan had shown her once, a perfectly framed portrait of his mother in one of their family albums. But the pictures didn't capture the sheer presence of the woman. She was statuesque, draped in an elegant ivory dress, her platinum blonde hair pulled into a perfect chignon. Every inch of her radiated authority. Her expression was carefully controlled, not quite a smile, but not outright hostility either. She took a slow step forward, her heels barely making a sound against the marble floors. "Leila," she said, drawing out the name as if she were tasting it for the first time. Leila extended her hand. "It's nice to finally meet you, Mrs. Callaway." Eleanor hesitated, just for a fraction of a second, before taking it. Her grip was cool, firm, and brief. "Welcome," she said smoothly. "I trust the drive wasn't too exhausting." Leila was about to answer when Richard Callaway appeared behind his wife. If Eleanor was controlled elegance, Richard was pure dominance. Tall, broad-shouldered, with a face that had aged like carved stone, he was the type of man whose mere presence commanded rooms. His salt and pepper hair was slicked back, his suit perfectly tailored. Everything about him screamed old money. Unlike Eleanor, he didn't offer a handshake. He barely looked at Leila. "Son," he said, addressing Ethan as if Leila weren't even there. "You're late." Ethan exhaled, offering a small laugh. "Traffic." Richard's gaze flickered toward Leila, scanning her as though he were assessing a business acquisition rather than his future daughter-in-law. Then, without a word, he turned and walked back inside. Leila's stomach tightened. This was not the warm welcome she had hoped for. Inside, the estate was even grander than she had imagined. The floors were polished mahogany, gleaming under the glow of chandeliers. Massive oil paintings of Callaway ancestors lined the hallways, their eyes seeming to follow her as she walked. Every table, every chair, every carefully placed floral arrangement felt deliberate, as though the house itself was curated to reflect the Callaway legacy. Eleanor led them into a vast sitting room, where a fire crackled in an ornate stone fireplace. "You must be tired from the trip," she said, taking her seat on a velvet chaise lounge. "We've prepared the West Wing for you." Leila hesitated. "The West Wing?" Eleanor nodded, sipping from a crystal glass of white wine. "It's the best guest suite. Lovely view of the gardens." Leila's pulse quickened. Guest suite. Not Ethan's room. She glanced at Ethan, expecting him to say something, to correct his mother. But he simply rubbed the back of his neck, offering her a small, apologetic smile. "It's just for now," he murmured under his breath. "Until they adjust." Adjust. The word settled heavily in her chest. She should have known then. Should have realized that this was not a home she was meant to belong to. The first few days were polite but distant. Eleanor was always impeccably composed, treating Leila as though she were an unexpected guest rather than a future daughter-in-law. It was in the small things. The way the staff addressed Eleanor as Madam, but Leila simply as Miss Williams. The way decisions about the estate were made without consulting her. The way she was subtly excluded from family conversations. She tried to win them over. She offered to help with events, tried to engage Richard in discussions about business. It was met with silent dismissal. And Ethan? He saw none of it. Whenever she brought it up, he brushed it aside. "They just need time," he would say, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "They'll come around." But they didn't. Days turned into weeks, and the weight of it all began suffocating her. She would walk into a room, and the conversations would halt, briefly, before resuming as though she wasn't even there. The house staff mirrored Eleanor's attitude, polite but detached. They answered her when spoken to but never warmed to her. One afternoon, she overheard a conversation between two of the maids as she passed through the corridor. "I don't know why she bothers," one of them whispered. "She'll never be one of them." Leila stopped in her tracks. The realization hit her like a cold wave. She was not welcome here. Not truly. And perhaps, she never would be. Leila had always been a woman of strength. She had spent years proving herself, climbing the ranks in a career that demanded resilience and discipline. But inside the Callaway estate, she felt herself slowly unraveling. At first, she had told herself that it was just an adjustment period, that things would settle, that she would eventually find her place in this world of wealth and tradition. But the longer she stayed, the clearer it became, there was no place for her here. Eleanor Callaway made sure of that. Every detail of the house, every event, every decision, it all went through her. She ran the estate with the precision of a queen, dictating everything from the floral arrangements in the dining hall to the guest lists for their lavish gatherings. Nothing happened without her approval. Leila tried, at first, to insert herself into the household, to contribute. She offered ideas for renovations, suggested minor changes to the menu, even volunteered to help coordinate a charity gala. Each time, Eleanor dismissed her with a polite but firm smile. "That won't be necessary, dear," she would say. Leila quickly realized that her input wasn't just unwelcome, it was unwanted. Even the staff followed Eleanor's lead, treating Leila with distant formality. They would take instructions from Eleanor without question, but when Leila asked for something, they would hesitate, as if waiting for confirmation from the true mistress of the house. Then, there was Ethan. At first, she had found comfort in the fact that no matter how cold his family was, at least he was on her side. But then, he was never around. Ethan's business trips became more frequent. He was always traveling, to New York, to London, to Tokyo, always closing some deal, securing another acquisition. Each time he left, he promised it would be temporary. "Once things settle down, I'll be home more," he would say. But things never settled down. She spent more nights alone than she did with her husband. The house, with all its grandeur, began to feel less like a home and more like a museum, one where she was just another ornament on display. The passive aggression from the Callaways only grew worse. At dinner, Richard would bring up their family's prestigious lineage, tracing back to the early 1800s, before glancing at Leila as if to remind her that she was not part of that history. Eleanor would comment on her mannerisms, subtly implying that she lacked the refinement of a Callaway woman. "You have a very modern way of speaking," she said once over tea, stirring her cup without looking up. Leila had forced a smile. "I suppose that's just how I was raised." Eleanor smiled back, but there was no warmth in it. "Yes, I imagine so." Then there was Caroline, Ethan's sister, who never missed an opportunity to remind Leila that she was out of place. At one of their exclusive gatherings, as Leila stood beside Ethan, smiling and making polite conversation, Caroline leaned in and whispered, "You must feel so out of your depth here." Leila had clenched her teeth. "Not at all." Caroline chuckled. "Really? Because if I were you, I'd be exhausted, keeping up this whole act." The word stung, but Leila refused to let her see it. She told herself she was stronger than this, that she wouldn't let them break her. But the isolation grew heavier. Her one escape was the garden. It was the only place where she could breathe. A sprawling sanctuary behind the estate, filled with blooming magnolias, neatly trimmed hedges, and a small stone pathway that led to a secluded fountain. Here, she found a sense of peace, away from the whispers, the stares, the carefully disguised insults. She would sit for hours, listening to the trickle of the water, staring at the sky, wondering how she had ended up here. She had once been Leila Williams, the surgeon, a woman respected for her intelligence, her skill, her independence. Now, she was just Ethan's wife. And then, one day, Eleanor made sure she understood that even that title meant nothing. It started small, little details around the house that changed without Leila's input. The paintings she had hung in the sitting room were replaced with older, more appropriate artwork. The furniture in their bedroom was rearranged to fit Eleanor's preferred style. Even the wardrobe in Leila's closet began to shift, her sleek, modern dresses mysteriously vanished, replaced with more traditional gowns Eleanor had selected for her. Leila said nothing at first, telling herself it wasn't worth the fight. But then, one afternoon, she walked into the dining room and froze. The long mahogany table, usually set for 12, had been rearranged. The seat where she always sat, beside Ethan, was gone. In its place was a new seating arrangement, one where she was positioned at the far end of the table, away from the family. It was subtle. Deliberate. Leila looked at Eleanor, who stood at the head of the table, adjusting a floral centerpiece as if nothing had changed. "What is this?" Leila asked. Eleanor barely glanced at her. "Oh, I made a few adjustments. I think this arrangement is much more fitting." Fitting. The word echoed in her mind. Leila felt her hands curl into fists. She had endured months of this, being dismissed, excluded, ignored. But this? This was something else. This was erasure. She was not just being treated as an outsider, she was being removed, piece by piece, from the life she had tried to build. Leila looked around the room, at the portraits of the Callaway men and women who had come before, at the carefully arranged silverware, the gleaming chandelier above them. And for the first time, she realized something terrifying. This house had never been hers. This marriage had never been hers. And if she didn't do something soon, she would disappear completely. Leila had always imagined that motherhood would be a transformative experience, something that would change everything. She had convinced herself that a child would be the bridge, a way to finally be accepted into the Calloway family, to solidify her place in their world. She had desperately wanted to believe that this pregnancy would be the thing that turned the tide, that Eleanor and Richard would finally look at her as something more than an outsider. But hope, as she would soon learn, was a dangerous thing. It started the morning she took the pregnancy test. 2 pink lines. The proof that a life was growing inside her, that she and Ethan were creating something together, something that no one, not even Eleanor, could take away. Her hands trembled as she held the test, staring at it in disbelief. A wave of emotion washed over her, excitement, fear, uncertainty. But more than anything, she felt relief. This child would change things. It had to. When she told Ethan that night, he lit up in a way she hadn't seen in months. "Are you serious?" he breathed, his hands tightening around hers. Leila nodded, watching the emotions flicker across his face. Relief. Joy. Pride. A wide smile broke across his lips. "We're having a baby," he whispered, almost to himself, before pulling her into his arms. "Leila, this is incredible." For the first time in a long time, she felt like they were truly on the same side. But that feeling wouldn't last. The next morning, they sat across from Eleanor and Richard at breakfast, the weight of the news buzzing in the air. Ethan reached for Leila's hand beneath the table, giving it a reassuring squeeze. Then he said it. "We're pregnant." Silence. Leila had expected shock, maybe even delight, but instead, all she got was an unreadable expression from Eleanor and an almost bored glance from Richard. Eleanor placed her fork down, dabbing her mouth with a cloth napkin before finally speaking. "Well," she said smoothly, "I suppose congratulations are in order." Leila's stomach twisted. The words felt hollow, a formality, nothing more. Richard barely looked up from his newspaper. "I trust we'll ensure the child is raised properly. As a Calloway should be." Something about the way he said it, the casual, almost dismissive way he laid claim to a child who hadn't even been born yet, made Leila's skin crawl. Her grip on her fork tightened. "This child will be raised by me and Ethan," she said, her voice firmer than she expected. Richard let out a quiet hum, finally meeting her gaze for the first time that morning. "Of course," he said. "But you must understand, Leila, this is bigger than just you. This child is a Calloway. And with that name comes responsibility." Eleanor nodded in agreement. "Naturally, we'll be involved in decisions regarding the baby's upbringing. Education, social circles, exposure to the right traditions." She waved a hand as if these were all foregone conclusions. Leila felt her chest tighten. Ethan, to her horror, said nothing. She turned to him, searching his face for some sign of resistance, but he only squeezed her hand again. "They're just excited," he murmured. "They want to be part of this." Excited? Leila wanted to laugh. This wasn't excitement. This was control, wrapped in polite conversation and centuries of entitlement. The more the pregnancy progressed, the clearer it became that she was no longer in control. Eleanor took it upon herself to plan every detail, from what Leila should eat to what brand of baby clothes she should buy. "The Calloway children have always been dressed in traditional styles," Eleanor said one afternoon, flipping through a catalog of expensive baby boutiques. "No need for those modern trends." Leila clenched her jaw. "I'll be choosing what my baby wears." Eleanor didn't even look up. "Of course, dear," she said, in that same condescending tone she always used when she wanted Leila to believe she had a choice. The nursery, once a project Leila had been excited to design, was taken over as well. One afternoon, she walked in to find that the soft, neutral colors she had picked had been replaced with Callaway blue and gold. The walls had been redone, the furniture swapped out. Leila's stomach dropped. She turned to Ethan, who stood in the doorway, watching her reaction carefully. "Mom had the decorators come in today," he said. Leila could feel her pulse pounding in her ears. "She changed everything," she whispered. Ethan stepped forward, rubbing her shoulders. "It's not a big deal. She just thought." Leila pulled away. "She just thought what? That I have no say in my own child's life?" Ethan sighed. "Leila, please. It's just a nursery." But it wasn't. It was more than that. It was the final confirmation that this wasn't about her. It never had been. This child wasn't just hers. In Eleanor's eyes, this child belonged to the Callaways. And Leila? She was nothing more than the woman who had carried it. She began to feel the walls closing in. Richard, who had been largely indifferent toward her before, now suddenly had opinions. He spoke about private schools before the baby was even born, about the Callaway traditions that must be upheld. One evening, over dinner, he finally said it outright. "You should consider stepping back from work, Leila," he said. "A child needs a mother's full attention." Leila stared at him. "I am a surgeon," she said slowly. Richard smiled, the kind of smile that wasn't really a smile at all. "And that's admirable, of course. But we must be realistic. A child born into this family will have expectations." Leila turned to Ethan, waiting for him to say something, to defend her. But he didn't. Instead, he reached for his wine glass and stared at his plate. That was the moment she knew. Nothing would change. Not for her. Not for her child. She would always be fighting for control, always battling against a family that saw her as nothing more than a temporary inconvenience. And if she stayed, her child would be raised in a world where Leila's voice didn't matter. She couldn't let that happen. As she lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling, her hand resting over the curve of her stomach, she whispered the words she hadn't let herself say out loud. "I have to leave." She didn't know how. She didn't know when. But one thing was certain. She would not raise her child in this house. And she would never let them win. The Callaway Annual Business Gala was more than just a lavish event, it was a display of power. A gathering of the city's wealthiest, a place where the elite reaffirmed their status, where deals were struck over champagne, and where appearances mattered more than reality. For weeks, Eleanor had been meticulously planning the evening, ensuring that every detail reflected the Callaway legacy. The ballroom of their grand estate had been transformed, the towering chandeliers casting a warm golden glow over tables adorned with fine china and crystal glassware. The guests were carefully curated, CEOs, senators, heirs to old money empires, each of them carrying the weight of generations of wealth. And in the midst of it all stood Leila, her hands clenched into fists, forcing herself to smile. She had known this night would be difficult, but she hadn't anticipated just how cruel they would be. Ethan stood beside her, greeting guests with the same effortless charm he always had. He looked completely at ease, as if nothing in their world had shifted. As if he hadn't stood by silently while his family slowly erased her existence from their lives. Leila felt the weight of every glance, every whispered remark. She doesn't belong here. She's just a phase. They'll sort it out soon enough. She had heard enough. But the final blow came from Caroline Callaway. Ethan's sister had always been the most openly hostile toward her, but tonight, she decided to make her disdain public. It happened so effortlessly, so perfectly calculated that it could have been mistaken for an accident. Caroline, standing just a few feet away, lifted her glass of red wine in an elegant toast. To tradition, she said, her lips curling into something that was not quite a smile. And then, with a deliberate flick of her wrist, she tipped the glass forward. The deep scarlet liquid splashed onto Leila's dress, staining the delicate fabric like spilled blood. For a moment, time stood still. The air crackled with tension, the gasps from nearby guests quickly muffling into stifled amusement. Leila could feel the warmth of the wine seeping into her skin, but more than that, she felt the eyes on her, watching, waiting, enjoying her humiliation. Caroline covered her mouth in a theatrical gasp. "Oh, Leila. I'm so sorry. How clumsy of me." Laughter rippled through the crowd, soft, polite, cruel. Leila looked down at herself. The deep crimson stain spread across her silk gown, an unmistakable mark of ridicule. She turned to Ethan. He stood motionless, his jaw tight, his gaze fixed anywhere but on her. He wasn't going to say anything. He wasn't going to defend her. Leila's stomach twisted. Eleanor reached for a napkin, dabbing at the tablecloth with a soft chuckle. "These things happen," she said lightly, as if the moment was nothing more than a minor inconvenience. Leila felt something inside her snap. She had endured enough. She had bitten her tongue through the insults, through the passive-aggressive comments, through the slow erasure of her presence in her own marriage. But tonight? Tonight, they had done it in public. And Ethan? He had let them. Without a word, Leila pushed back her chair and stood. The laughter faded. Silence fell over the room. She reached for her napkin, slowly dabbing at the stain on her gown, her movements deliberate, controlled. She wasn't shaking. She wasn't crying. She was done. Without another glance at Ethan, at Caroline, at Eleanor or Richard or any of the guests who had found amusement in her humiliation, Leila turned and walked out of the ballroom. Her heels echoed against the marble floors, the only sound in the hushed silence. No one stopped her. Not Ethan. Not his family. Not even the staff, who had learned long ago to look away. She climbed the grand staircase with measured steps, her heart pounding in her chest, but her mind clearer than it had been in months. When she reached their bedroom, she locked the door behind her. She didn't cry. She didn't hesitate. Instead, she walked straight to the closet, pulling open a drawer where she had hidden the documents she had been collecting for weeks. Bank statements. Legal papers. Proof of everything. She wasn't just leaving. She was taking her child with her. Her hands moved quickly, reaching for the small suitcase she had hidden weeks ago, just in case. Inside, she had packed the essentials, a few changes of clothes, cash she had quietly set aside, important documents. She had told herself she wouldn't need it. That she could make this marriage work. But tonight had been the final confirmation. She had lost herself here. And she wasn't going to let them take anything more. With one last glance at the ornate bedroom, at the portrait of the Calloway ancestors hanging on the wall, Leila inhaled deeply. Then she picked up her suitcase and walked toward the door. She didn't know where she would go yet. But one thing was certain. She was never coming back. Leila sat on the edge of the bed, her hands gripping the papers she had hidden for weeks. The humiliation of the gala still burned inside her, but more than that, there was clarity. A calm, calculated certainty that she had never felt before. She had been foolish to think she could ever belong here. She had ignored the signs, let herself believe that love would be enough. But love, if you could even call it that anymore, wasn't enough when you were drowning. And she had been drowning for far too long. Now, she had one goal. Escape. But she couldn't afford to be reckless. The Calloways were powerful, and if she made one mistake, they would take everything from her, including her daughter. She had to be smart. She had to be prepared. And she had to be invisible until the moment she was ready to run. The first thing she did was secure the documents. For weeks, she had been quietly gathering information, small pieces of evidence she knew would give her leverage when the time came. Richard Calloway was not the untouchable businessman he pretended to be. She had heard the whispers, seen the meetings held in hushed voices behind closed doors. Offshore accounts, questionable business dealings, financial statements that didn't quite add up. She had started looking into it months ago, at first out of curiosity, then out of necessity. Now, those documents were her lifeline. She had photocopied emails, printed financial reports, and tucked them away in a file hidden inside a hollowed-out book in the library, a place no one ever touched. That night, after the gala, she retrieved them. Every page was a weapon. If Richard ever tried to come after her, if Ethan fought her for custody, she would burn their empire to the ground. Next, she met with Daniel Lawson. She had found him through a discreet recommendation, a lawyer with a reputation for taking down the powerful. He had built his career by exposing corrupt businessmen, and when she had first reached out to him, she could tell he was skeptical. Now, as she sat across from him in his dimly lit office, she saw the moment he realized just how serious she was. She placed the folder on his desk. "This is everything I have on the Calloways." Daniel flipped through the pages, his sharp eyes scanning each document carefully. After a few minutes, he leaned back in his chair, rubbing his jaw. "This is impressive," he admitted. "You're telling me you collected all of this on your own?" Leila nodded. "And there's more where that came from." He exhaled slowly, considering. "You're not just leaving, are you?" he finally asked. "You're preparing for war." She met his gaze, unflinching. "If they try to take my daughter from me, yes." Daniel studied her for a long moment before nodding. "All right. Here's what we do." They spent the next hour laying out the plan. The divorce papers would be drawn up, but they wouldn't be filed until she was safely out. They would begin moving money, quietly, in small amounts, to an undisclosed account. And most importantly, he would be ready to fight for full custody the moment she left. "You have to understand," Daniel warned, "Ethan's family won't take this lying down. They'll use everything they have against you. Their lawyers, their influence, hell, even the media if they have to." Leila already knew that. She had seen how they operated, how easily they controlled narratives, how they made problems disappear. But they had underestimated her. She wasn't just a wife they could discard. She wasn't just a name they could erase. She was Leila Williams. And she was done playing by their rules. Over the next few days, she began quietly preparing. She made small withdrawals from her personal bank account, careful not to raise suspicion. She transferred funds to a new account, one that no one, not even Ethan, knew about. She packed a small bag, one that she kept hidden in the back of her closet, filled with only the essentials, clothes for herself and Sophia, important documents, enough cash to get her through the first few weeks. She even mapped out her escape route. There were security cameras around the estate, guards who monitored the property at night. She studied their patterns, figured out when they took breaks, when the shift changed. She needed to leave undetected. Because if Eleanor or Richard found out before she was gone, she would never make it out. The night of the escape arrived sooner than expected. She had planned to wait a few more days, to make sure everything was in place, but then something happened that forced her hand. That afternoon, Eleanor had taken Sophia from her arms without asking, again. But this time, she had said something different. "She's growing so fast," Eleanor mused, rocking the baby gently. "You know, we've been discussing her future, and I think it would be best if she started spending more time with us." Leila frowned. "What do you mean?" Eleanor smiled. "Well, it's only natural that she's raised with the Calloway influence. We'll ensure she gets the right upbringing, the right connections. She'll be surrounded by the best people." Leila's stomach twisted. "Eleanor, she's my daughter. Eleanor's expression didn't change. She's a Calloway. The words were a warning. A reminder. A threat. That night, after Ethan had fallen asleep, after the house had gone quiet, Leila crept into Sophia's nursery. Her daughter slept soundly, her tiny fingers curled into fists. Leila's chest tightened. She would never let them take her. She would never let them win. With careful hands, she lifted Sophia from the crib, cradling her against her chest. She moved quickly, silently, grabbing the bag she had packed, slipping into the hallway. She could hear her own heartbeat, feel the weight of every step as she made her way to the back entrance. The house was silent. But her instincts screamed that she wasn't alone. She reached for the door, hand trembling as she turned the handle. And then, a voice behind her. "You're making a mistake." Leila froze. Eleanor stood at the top of the staircase, watching her with cold, knowing eyes. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then, Eleanor took a slow step forward. "Where do you think you're going?" Leila's grip on Sophia tightened. She forced herself to breathe. Forced herself to stay calm. She would not back down. She would not let them stop her. She lifted her chin, met Eleanor's gaze head-on. "I'm taking my daughter," she said, her voice steady. "And I'm leaving." Eleanor tilted her head slightly, considering. Then, finally, she spoke. "You won't get far." Leila's jaw clenched. "Watch me." And then, without waiting for a response, she pushed open the door and stepped into the night. The night air was thick with silence as Leila stepped out onto the cold marble floor of the hallway. Every nerve in her body was on edge, her arms wrapped tightly around Sophia's small, sleeping form. The baby stirred slightly, her tiny fist pressing against Leila's shoulder, but she didn't wake. Leila forced herself to take a slow, steady breath. She had to stay calm. She had to move fast. The house was massive, but she had memorized the layout months ago, studying every hallway, every possible exit, every blind spot the security cameras didn't cover. She had watched the patterns of the night staff, learning when they took breaks, when the guards outside the estate switched shifts. This was her moment. She moved quickly but carefully, her footsteps light against the polished floor. The grand staircase loomed ahead, its dark wooden railings gleaming in the dim glow of the chandelier. She clutched Sophia tighter, her heart hammering in her chest. "Don't look back. Just keep going." Step by step, she descended, her breath catching with each soft creak of the stairs. She could hear the faint hum of voices coming from one of the sitting rooms. Eleanor and Richard were still awake. Good. That means they weren't near the back entrance. She reached the main hallway and moved toward the side corridor that led to the kitchen. From there, she could slip out through the servants' entrance, which led directly to the garage. Her car was parked at the far end, outside the view of the estate's front gates. She had planned everything down to the second. She was going to make it. And then, a shadow moved at the end of the hall. Leila froze. Her pulse spiked as Eleanor stepped into view, still dressed in her elegant evening gown from the gala, as if she had been waiting. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Eleanor tilted her head slightly, studying her, her expression calm. "Where do you think you're going?" Leila's grip on Sophia tightened. She refused to show fear. "I'm leaving." Eleanor's lips curved into something that was almost amusement. "With my granddaughter?" Leila's jaw clenched. "With my daughter." Eleanor exhaled softly, shaking her head. "Leila, be reasonable. Where exactly do you plan to go in the middle of the night? With no protection? No resources?" She took a slow, deliberate step forward. "You can't do this alone." Leila stood her ground. "I won't let you raise her. I won't let you decide her life like you tried to decide mine." Eleanor's eyes flickered with something cold. You don't have a choice. Leila let out a sharp laugh, but there was no humor in it. You really think you can stop me? Eleanor didn't move, didn't blink. I don't need to stop you, Leila. I just need to remind you of what will happen next. Her voice was calm, smooth, as if she were explaining something logical, something inevitable. You walk out that door, and you lose everything. Ethan will file for full custody. And when this goes to court, guess who they'll believe? A Calloway, or a desperate woman who ran in the middle of the night? Leila's chest tightened, but she forced herself to stay steady. Eleanor took another step closer. Be smart. Go back upstairs. We'll forget this ever happened. For a moment, there was only silence. Then, Leila spoke. Watch me. Without another word, she pushed past Eleanor, her shoulder barely brushing against her as she stepped into the kitchen. She could feel Eleanor's cold gaze burning into her back, but she didn't stop. She would not stop. The moment she reached the door, she shoved it open and slipped into the night. The air outside was crisp, the cool wind whipping against her skin as she sprinted toward the car. She barely felt the gravel beneath her shoes, barely noticed anything beyond the thundering of her heartbeat in her ears. She reached the car and yanked open the door, quickly strapping Sophia into the back seat. The baby stirred but didn't wake. Leila's hands shook as she slid into the driver's seat. She jammed the key into the ignition. And the moment the engine roared to life, she felt the weight of everything crash down on her. This was it. There was no turning back now. She pressed her foot against the gas, and the car shot forward, the estate shrinking behind her as she sped down the long driveway. She glanced in the rearview mirror. The mansion loomed against the night sky, its lights still glowing. But it was no longer her home. It never had been. Her grip on the wheel tightened as she reached the estate's back road, the trees blurring past her as she pushed the car faster. Keep driving. Don't stop. Don't look back. After an hour on the road, exhaustion began to creep in. She hadn't realized just how tense she had been until she finally saw the lights of the small, hidden motel up ahead. It was nothing like the Calloway estate. No grand entrance, no towering columns, just a simple rundown building with a flickering neon sign that read vacancy. It was perfect. She pulled into the parking lot and cut the engine. For a moment, she just sat there, gripping the steering wheel, her breath unsteady. Then she turned, looking at Sophia, who was still sound asleep in her car seat. She was safe. That was all that mattered. Leila reached into the glove compartment, pulling out the fake ID and the stack of cash she had prepared. She wouldn't use her credit cards, not yet. She couldn't risk them tracking her movements. She stepped out of the car, adjusting Sophia in her arms as she walked toward the front desk. The man behind the counter barely looked up as she slid the cash across the desk. Room for the night. He grunted, handing her a key. Room 12. She nodded, gripping the key tightly as she walked to the door. Once inside, she locked every bolt, every chain, every possible exit. Then she collapsed onto the bed, clutching Sophia to her chest. For the first time in what felt like forever, she let out a slow, shuddering breath. She had made it. But this was just the beginning. Because she knew one thing for certain. The Calloways wouldn't let her go without a fight. The morning after Leila escaped, she woke up to the sound of her phone vibrating against the nightstand. She sat up quickly, her heart pounding, panic flooding her system before she even knew why. The motel room was dimly lit, the faded curtains barely blocking out the early morning sun. Sophia slept beside her, her tiny chest rising and falling, blissfully unaware of the storm about to hit. Leila reached for her phone with trembling hands. The screen was flooded with missed calls. Ethan. Eleanor. Unknown numbers. And then, the text messages. Where the hell are you? You think you can just take my daughter and run? Come back now and we can fix this. Then another message came through. A link. Leila hesitated before clicking it. The second the web page loaded, her stomach dropped. It had begun. The headlines were everywhere. Callaway heiress kidnapped by mother in shocking disappearance. Leila Williams, unstable wife of Ethan Callaway, flees with child. Inside the scandal, what we know about the woman who stole her own daughter. Her breath caught in her throat. Every major news outlet had picked up the story. They were painting her as a criminal. They had wasted no time. She scrolled down, reading the carefully worded statements from the Callaway family. "We are heartbroken over this situation," Ethan was quoted saying. "Leila has been struggling emotionally, and we are doing everything in our power to bring our daughter home safely." Leila's hands shook. He was framing her as unstable. They weren't just going to fight for Sophia. They were going to destroy her. By the time Leila arrived at Daniel Lawson's office, she was shaking with fury. Daniel had been expecting her. He didn't even bother with pleasantries as he gestured for her to sit. "It's worse than I thought," he admitted, sliding a stack of papers toward her. "They filed for full custody first thing this morning. They're moving fast." Leila clenched her jaw. "They're making me look crazy." Daniel nodded. "That's the strategy. They don't just want to take Sophia. They want to make sure you can't fight back. If they prove you're unfit, they'll get an emergency order for full custody, and you might not see your daughter again until this case is over." Leila's chest tightened. "Then we fight." Daniel exhaled, leaning back in his chair. "We will. But you need to be prepared for how ugly this is going to get." The first hearing came quicker than Leila had expected. She sat in the courtroom, her hands clenched into fists beneath the table. Across from her, Ethan sat with his team of high-powered attorneys, dressed in an impeccably tailored suit, his face an unreadable mask of calm. The judge entered, and the courtroom fell silent. Ethan's lawyer stood first, a man with the kind of polished arrogance that came from representing the wealthy. "Your Honor," he began smoothly, "this case is not complicated. My client, Ethan Callaway, is a responsible father. He comes from a well-established family with deep roots in the community. He has the resources, the stability, and the means to provide his daughter with the best life possible." Leila felt her stomach turn. They were turning this into a class battle. The lawyer continued. "Miss Williams, on the other hand, acted irrationally. She abducted her daughter in the middle of the night, without any warning, without any legal discussions. This was not the behavior of a rational mother. It was reckless. Dangerous. She removed the child from her home, her father, and the only life she has ever known." He turned toward the judge. "The Callaway family is respected. They have deep moral values, a strong sense of tradition, and a legacy that they are committed to upholding. Sophia Callaway deserves to be raised in that environment." Leila felt her pulse quicken. They weren't even subtle about what they were implying. Sophia didn't belong with her. Because she wasn't a Callaway. Then it was Daniel's turn. He stood slowly, flipping open a folder. His voice was calm, but sharp as a blade. "Your Honor, this case is not about wealth. It is about what is best for the child." He glanced at Leila before continuing. "My client, Dr. Leila Williams, has been the sole emotional and physical caretaker of Sophia since birth. She has fed her, bathed her, stayed awake through fevers and nightmares. She has been there for every first step, every scraped knee. She has done all of this without the help of Mr. Callaway, who, might I remind the court, travels frequently and spends the majority of his time away on business." Daniel let the words sink in before turning to Ethan's lawyer. "Tell me," he said, tilting his head, when was the last time Mr. Calloway spent a full day with his daughter? Fed her? Put her to sleep? Ethan stiffened, but his lawyer recovered quickly. Mr. Calloway's career requires travel, but that does not make him any less of a father. Daniel smiled, but there was no warmth in it. Of course. But would the court not agree that a parent who is too busy to raise their own child should not be demanding sole custody? Silence. Then, Daniel pulled out his final weapon. Your Honor, I would like to present financial records indicating questionable activity within the Calloway estate. Offshore accounts. Dubious transactions. Unexplained sums of money moving between unregistered businesses. The Calloway family prides itself on tradition and morality, but what kind of values would Sophia be exposed to in that environment? Ethan's lawyers immediately objected. Irrelevant. The judge raised a hand. Overruled. Proceed, Mr. Lawson. Daniel continued, laying down every carefully collected document, exposing just enough to make the Calloways uncomfortable. Ethan's jaw clenched. For the first time, Leila saw a flicker of real anger in his expression. He hadn't expected her to come prepared. The judge leaned back in his chair, considering. Then he spoke. This is a complex case. Given the evidence presented, I will need more time to review all materials before making a final decision. In the meantime, temporary custody will remain with Dr. Williams until further notice. Leila's breath caught in her throat. She had won round one. But this wasn't over. As court adjourned, Ethan stormed past her, his voice low and furious. You think you've won? Leila met his gaze, unwavering. I think I've only just begun. The courtroom was silent, the air thick with tension. The fluorescent lights buzzed softly overhead, casting a stark glow over the mahogany tables and the stern-faced judge who sat at the bench. The weight of everything, the months of battle, the sleepless nights, the fear, pressed down on Leila's chest like a heavy stone. But she didn't waver. This was it. The final hearing. The moment that would determine whether she would get to keep her daughter, or whether Sophia would be raised in a world where Leila was nothing more than a footnote in her own child's life. Ethan sat across from her, his face calm, unreadable, but she knew him too well. The slight tension in his jaw, the barely perceptible tapping of his fingers against the table, he was nervous. He had always been good at controlling his image, but today, for the first time, she could sense the cracks beneath the polished surface. The judge cleared his throat, glancing over the documents in front of him before looking up. We will now hear the testimony of Mr. Ethan Calloway. Ethan stood, adjusting his tie as he stepped onto the witness stand. His lawyer, a man whose smug confidence had become increasingly unbearable over the past few weeks, approached him with a measured smile. Mr. Calloway, can you please tell the court about your role as a father? Ethan nodded. His voice was smooth, rehearsed. I love my daughter more than anything in the world. From the moment she was born, she became the most important thing in my life. I have always provided for her, ensured she has everything she needs, and made sure she would grow up with the best possible future. Leila clenched her fists beneath the table. Daniel, her lawyer, leaned in slightly and whispered, let him talk. The more he builds himself up, the harder he'll fall. Ethan continued, his tone deliberate, calculated. I never wanted this situation to escalate. I wanted to resolve things peacefully. But Leila acted irrationally. She kidnapped my daughter in the middle of the night, cut off all communication, and forced us into this legal battle. I was left with no choice but to fight for my rights as a father. His lawyer nodded sympathetically. And in your opinion, do you believe Dr. Williams is fit to raise your child on her own? Ethan hesitated, just long enough for his next words to feel like a carefully placed dagger. I believe Leila loves Sophia. But love isn't always enough. Parenting requires stability, a strong foundation. My family has provided that for generations. Sophia deserves a life of security, of opportunity. And I worry that, in Leila's care, she may not have that. There it was. The polite way of saying, she isn't good enough. Leila's nails dug into her palms, but she kept her expression neutral. The judge turned toward Daniel. Mr. Lawson, your cross-examination? Daniel stood, buttoning his jacket before walking toward Ethan with the ease of a man who had been waiting for this moment. Mr. Calloway, he began, his voice even. You say you love your daughter? Ethan nodded. Of course. And yet, by your own admission, you spend most of your time traveling for work, correct? Ethan's jaw tensed. I run a company. It requires my attention. Daniel nodded. I see. And during those times when you were away, who was caring for Sophia? Ethan hesitated. Leila was. Daniel raised an eyebrow. So, the woman you claim is unfit to raise your daughter, was the one actually raising her? A ripple of murmurs moved through the courtroom. Ethan's lawyer objected. Argumentative. The judge raised a hand. Overruled. Answer the question, Mr. Calloway. Ethan exhaled sharply. Leila took care of her when I was away, yes. But that doesn't mean. Daniel cut him off. Let's talk about stability, then. You mentioned that the Calloway family provides it. Tell me, Mr. Calloway, did that stability extend to your marriage? Ethan's lawyer objected again. Irrelevant. Daniel held up a stack of papers. I have documents detailing multiple instances of Mr. Calloway's absence during crucial moments in his daughter's life. Missed doctor's appointments, missed birthdays. I also have records of financial transactions suggesting Mr. Calloway's priorities were elsewhere. Offshore accounts. Unexplained wire transfers. If we're talking about stability, perhaps the court should question whether Mr. Calloway's focus has ever truly been on his daughter at all. Ethan shifted in his seat, his carefully constructed image starting to crack. The judge turned toward Leila. Dr. Williams, please step forward. She took a steady breath as she walked to the stand. Daniel approached, his voice softer now. Leila, tell us in your own words, why did you leave? She swallowed, the weight of the past months pressing against her, but she refused to break. Because I knew, if I stayed, I would disappear. Silence filled the courtroom. She continued, her voice unwavering. For months, I tried to make this marriage work. I tried to be the wife, the daughter-in-law, the perfect addition to the Calloway family. And every step of the way, I was shut out. Controlled. Erased. She turned to Ethan, her eyes steady. And you let it happen. Ethan looked away. She turned back to the judge. I ran because I realized that, in their eyes, Sophia wasn't just my daughter, she was their heir. A Calloway legacy. And I was nothing more than an inconvenience. A murmur spread through the courtroom again, hushed voices whispering among themselves. Leila's voice never wavered. I didn't run because I wanted to hurt Ethan. I ran because I wanted to protect my child. Because I knew that if I stayed, they would take her from me, piece by piece, until she was no longer mine at all. Daniel nodded. And what do you want today? Leila turned to the judge, her eyes filled with quiet determination. I just want to be her mother. The courtroom was silent. The judge leaned back in his chair, deep in thought. The weight of his decision hung in the air like a storm cloud. After what felt like an eternity, he spoke. In the matter of custody of Sophia Calloway, this court finds in favor of Dr. Leila Williams. Full custody is awarded to the mother. The father will have supervised visitation. The words hit like a shockwave. Leila's breath caught. She had won. Across the room, Ethan's calm mask finally cracked. His face darkened, his hands clenching into fists. He stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "This isn't over," he hissed under his breath as he stormed past her. Leila didn't flinch. She didn't need to. Because she had already won the only battle that mattered. She turned, walking out of the courtroom with her head held high, knowing one thing for certain. Sophia was finally safe. The new apartment was small, barely big enough for 2 people, but to Leila, it felt endless. No servants hovering around, no towering walls covered in portraits of people she didn't belong to, no suffocating silence where her voice had never been welcome. Just peace. She stood by the window, cradling a warm cup of coffee in her hands, watching as the city buzzed below her. A different kind of life, a different kind of future. One she had chosen for herself, without the weight of the Calloway name pressing down on her shoulders. Behind her, Sophia babbled happily on the floor, stacking wooden blocks, oblivious to the battle her mother had just fought to keep her safe. Leila had won. But victory didn't feel like she had imagined. It wasn't a grand moment of celebration. It was quiet. It was steady. It was the ability to breathe again. For the first time in a long time, she was not afraid. She crouched down beside Sophia, brushing a curl from her daughter's face. "What do you think, sweetheart?" she whispered. "This is home now." Sophia clapped her hands together, giggling. Leila smiled, pressing a kiss to her forehead. No wealth. No mansion. No power games. Just the 2 of them. And it was enough. A week passed. Then another. Leila spent her days settling into their new life, rebuilding from the ground up. She had found a job at a small but reputable clinic, nothing close to the prestige of her former hospital, but it was honest work. And for the first time in years, she felt like she was working for herself, not for an image, not for appearances. She picked up Sophia from daycare every evening, something she never could have done before. They had dinners together, read bedtime stories, took long walks in the park. One afternoon, as she was making lunch, she heard a tiny, excited squeal from the living room. She turned just in time to see Sophia pulling herself up, gripping the edge of the coffee table. For a moment, she wobbled, uncertain. Then, with a determined little grunt, she let go. One step. Then another. And then. She took off, giggling, her little legs unsteady but sure. Leila dropped the spoon she was holding, covering her mouth in shock. "Oh my God, baby, you did it," she gasped, rushing over, catching Sophia just as she toppled forward into her arms. Sophia squealed with joy, clapping her hands. Leila laughed through the tears spilling down her face, pressing kisses all over her daughter's cheeks. "You're walking," she whispered. "You're really walking." A year ago, she would have been watching from the sidelines while a nanny reported back to her. Now, she was here. And nothing else mattered. That night, as she rocked Sophia to sleep, her phone buzzed from across the room. She knew who it was before she even looked. Slowly, she walked over, picking it up. "Ethan." She stared at the screen, debating whether to answer. Then she opened the message. "You think you won, but you have no idea what you've done. You ruined everything. One day, you'll regret this." Leila exhaled, shaking her head. There was a time when words like that would have shaken her, would have made her second-guess herself, would have made her wonder if she had really made the right choice. Not anymore. She deleted the message. Then, for good measure, she blocked his number. She was done. As she lay in bed that night, listening to the soft sound of Sophia's breathing, she stared at the ceiling, thinking about everything it had taken to get here. She had walked away from money, power, security, at least, that's how the Calloways would have seen it. But what she had really walked away from was a life where she didn't exist. She had chosen herself. She had chosen her daughter. And as she closed her eyes, a single thought settled in her mind with absolute certainty. I didn't just escape. I won. Every story leaves behind a lesson, a truth that lingers long after the final page is turned. Leila's journey wasn't just about escape, it was about reclaiming herself. About realizing that love, when built on control and manipulation, isn't love at all. That sometimes, walking away isn't weakness, but the greatest act of strength. She learned that power isn't measured in wealth or legacy, but in the ability to stand tall when the world tries to erase you. That the loudest victories aren't always the ones that shake the ground, but the quiet moments, the first steps of a child, the peace of an unburdened heart, the knowledge that you chose yourself and never looked back. This story is a reminder that no one gets to define your worth. No name, no family, no history can decide who you are, only you can do that. And when the time comes to fight for yourself, for what matters, you fight. You take back your life, piece by piece, until it belongs to you again. Because survival is not enough. You deserve to live. And if this story resonated with you, if you believe in the power of resilience, in the strength it takes to break free, then make sure you're here for the next one. Subscribe now and turn on notifications, because the next story might just be the one you need to hear.